Welcome to the History Unplugged podcast, the unscripted show that celebrates unsung heroes, myth-busts historical lies, and rediscovers the forgotten stories that changed our world. I'm your host, Scott Rank. History and alcohol really go hand in hand, and I've had a few guests who've come on the show and talked about things such as prohibition, the drinking habits of monks in medieval monasteries, the alcohol choices of presidents and which ones gave their best speeches while drunk, and how basically everyone was hammered throughout the Civil War. In today's episode, I have a returning guest, Michael Foley, who is a professor of patristics at Baylor University in Texas. The last time he was on, Michael was here to talk about his book, Drinking with the Saints. They looked at such stories as how chartreuse, an herbal liqueur, was created by two Carthusian monks and is still made by them, even though only two monks at a time know the recipe. And frangelico liqueur was invented by a hermit monk during his time of solitude by experimenting with nuts, herbs, and berries he gathered. Today, we're here to talk about his book, Drinking with St. Nick, Christmas Cocktails for Sinners and Saints. We're going to look at how alcohol pairs with saints' legends and in the imagination of the Middle Ages, especially during Christmas time. We look at the historical St. Nicholas, how he was, in fact, a 4th century bishop, and an examination of his remains revealed that he liked to get into fights with other people, and how his legend morphed into Santa Claus, what sort of drink goes with his feast day, and a literal entire Advent calendar of cocktails that Michael came up with. So you learn about mixology, you learn about medieval history. What more could you ask for? Hope you enjoyed this discussion with Michael Foley. Michael, welcome back to the show.
Thank you so much, Scott.
So I was inspired by our discussion last time, and one part that stuck out was the emphasis on herbal liqueur. I think Benedictine, and the abbreviation that appears on each bottle in Latin. It's something glory to God. You might know off the top of your head, but what was that?
That's right. D-O-M, Deo Optimo Maximo, to God, the best and the greatest.
You might be ahead of the curve on this, or maybe I'm just noticing it more, but it seems in the craft cocktail scene, there's a lot of herbal liqueur coming out. One I noticed is specific for Kansas City, where I'm recording, called the Pendergast, which is in honor of Tom Pendergast, the machine boss who corruptly ran the city in the 1920s. So the cocktail has bourbon, sweet vermouth, bitters, and Benedictine in it. So I don't know if they'd be too happy about that legacy, but at least you seem to be ahead of the trend on herbal liqueur being thrown into everything these days.
Excellent. I'm also happy to see that mixologists are making more use of chartreuse, which is the best herbal liqueur still made by the Carthusian monks. And it is outstanding on its own, but they're also making good use of it in new cocktails.
Yeah, that came up in a discussion I had a few podcast episodes ago with someone who is a mixologist and focuses on these cocktails. And the drink that came up was something called the Last of the Oaxacans that uses mezcal. Oh. So the title... Yeah. So it's more about the title than the actual contents, but chartreuse was in that, and we got into the Carthusians and their vows of silence 6 out of the 7 days a week. And are they still holding to that only two brothers know the secret recipe? Is that still in effect?
That's what they say, yes. They haven't changed that.
Good. Well, I hope those two don't travel together too much, and barring a catastrophic railroad accident, we could be in trouble here.
That would be terrible.
Yeah, so be a little bit petty just to focus on the lost drink, I guess, but there we are. Right. Well, we have a lot more history to unpack in your recent efforts where you are looking more specifically, not just the history of drinking and the church, but drinking with St. Nick in particular. You go beyond just the person of St. Nick. But I want to start with him, because he's probably the most embellished historical figure out there. People are surprised that Santa Claus is very loosely based on an actual historical person. So let's start with St. Nicholas. What's his background, and how did you connect him to alcohol?
Well, first of all, he was a great bishop, and we really don't have a great deal of solid historical information about him. I mean, we know he was a historical figure, that he was a bishop, a firm defender of orthodoxy. But even shortly after his own lifetime, there were stories about the saint that may have been true. The most famous is the idea that he saved three daughters from prostitution by throwing bags of gold down their chimney so that they would have money for a dowry. And this is one of the ways in which St. Nicholas is associated with gift giving. There are also a lot of later stories from the Middle Ages about him being so incensed by the heretic Arius at the Council of Nicaea that he apparently walked up and slapped him. And for slapping a bishop, even a heretical bishop, he was exiled. So there are a lot of great stories about the saint, even before he morphed into Santa Claus. Sometimes, though, it's just hard to separate the legendary from the historical.
Well, you're a professor of patristics, so you look in the ancient world up to the early medieval period. From what I understand of saints' legends, there's a kernel of truth somewhere out there. Maybe there's a paragraph written by a chronicler or a biographer. And then over the generations, there are these saints' legends that come out. They can be apocryphal, and they start to grow and grow and grow to the point that the saint becomes a stock character who's used to make a moral point in some type of writing that a monk does. Do you have a sense of St. Nicholas? How does his story develop? This story that you mentioned of him giving money and saving women for prostitution in secret, is this connected to the earliest stories about him, or does this come about later?
I believe you're putting me on the spot, but I believe the stories about him throwing money into the window or down the chimney was relatively close to the saint's own time period. But the story about him decking Arius did not appear until maybe a good 400 years after the death of the saint. The funny thing, though, is that they did a forensic examination of St. Nicholas's skull, which is now in Bari, Italy. The Crusaders stole it during one of their ransackings of the Greek East, and the skull is now in Bari, Italy. They did a forensic analysis of it about 20 years ago, and they discovered that the nose on this skull of a 60-year-old man from the 4th century had been set and reset several times, which is consistent with the life of a professional boxer. So it may have actually been plausible that a guy used to fisticuffs walked up and decked Arius. So, who knows?
Yeah, have you heard theories about what that means? Because there's a bunch of things that jump into my mind. One is that maybe before his conversion experience, he was into fisticuffs, or maybe at that time period, it was simply more common to deal with things in that way. There might be a layer of gloss over how our bishops, centuries down the road, but maybe in the 4th century, when Christianity is barely just getting out of the underground, you had no reason for nicety when you were underground, and maybe that was still something there. That's just me spitballing, but have you heard anything of what the case could be?
I haven't heard any more than what you've just provided, but it makes sense to me, especially for the Greeks. They were very athletic. They practiced boxing and wrestling as a part of just, the gymnasium. It was part of the normal formation of a young man. So, and not unlike what a lot of Catholic parochial schools were doing in the early 20th century. They taught boxing. The parish priest taught boxing to the kids. It was a way of building character and knowing how to defend yourself.
Or priests in Mexico that get involved in luchador or lucha libre activities to fund their church. So there you go. The story goes on.
Right.
Okay, so he was alive in the 4th century. If he would have been around the Council of Nicaea in 330, I thought 5th century, but my numbers were probably wrong. Is that pretty well attested that he was bishop in the 4th century?
I believe so, yes.
And this was in the city of Smyrna in Western Turkey?
Correct.
Okay. Where did the Crusaders get his skull from? Was the church where his skull was located in Smyrna, or was it moved to Constantinople, and when the Crusaders went to ransacked it in the 4th Crusade, they took it then, or was it some other place?
I didn't research that deeply, so I don't know the answer. I'd always just assumed it was Constantinople because that was the major sacking of that region. So, yeah, I just assumed Constantinople, but it may have been elsewhere.
Right. That makes sense that the relics would flow upwards like that to the capital.
Right.
Well, yeah. So that's a bit of the story about St. Nicholas. And yeah, a lot of it has to be, well, guesswork and stripping away truth from legend. So let's get into the cocktail that you build around him and what inspired you for the particular ingredients, whether stories from his life or attributes of his character that you thought should find its way into a drink.
Well, we did sort of have fun with his association of being a somewhat violent defender of the faith. And so one of my friends, Peter Kwasniewski, came up with a drink entitled Anathema Sip, S-I-P instead of S-I-T, which probably is only funny to about a dozen theologians, but we thought it was hilarious. We also, the great thing about St. Nicholas is that he is an enormously popular saint, not just as Santa Claus, but as a patron for various countries, causes, and groups. I try to tally this up, but I honestly believe that next to the Blessed Virgin Mary, he has the most patronages of any saint on the books. Okay. He's beat only by the Mother of God. He's the patron saint of Russia, of Greece, of sailors, of this, of that. I mean, the list just goes on and on. And that gives us a wide array of options for thinking of drink choices.
Yeah, I'd like to dig into that. So beyond his historical person, his life in the Catholic Church as a patron saint, could you describe that? How does that grow over time? Why is he so important over the centuries? And what are the particular things that he's patron saint of?
You know, I don't have the list in front of me, but it's all over the place. And it was actually largely in the Eastern Church. The Greek Orthodox really love St. Nicholas. It is St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker. And his legend and his prowess just grew and grew over time. So like I mentioned, he became the patron saint of a lot of Orthodox countries, such as Greece and Russia. He is also invoked a lot with anyone who has anything to do with water or with trade involving water. So sailors, navies around the world, not just the Greek and Russian Navy, but I think the Argentine Navy invoked St. Nicholas. He just became a very popular saint for sailors and Navy personnel. And then traders as well, because merchants would use ports. And so then he became the patron saint of various kinds of merchants and businessmen. So he just kind of grew and grew in stature.
And the title of the cocktail, Anathema Sip, that definitely went over my head. So what would the original Latin phrase refer to?
So anathema sit is a line borrowed from St. Paul that basically says, let him be excommunicated. And that was the first time it was used at an ecumenical council was Nicaea, when they excommunicated Arius for not believing that Jesus Christ was true God and true man. So they would have said anathema sit to him, but we made a play on that and called it anathema sip.
So do you have a sense of what drinking culture would have been like in the time of St. Nicholas? I'm imagining it would be mostly wine-based, which there's still a viticulture in the place where he's from, and now Izmir, Turkey. It was pretty much leveled out with the Greek-Turkish population exchange in the 1920s, but now it's been coming back in recent years. Is that probably what have been around during the time of St. Nicholas?
My guess is yes. If not that particular culture, then something similar to it. The Greeks would have had lots of wine. It would have been mostly sweet wine, and it would have been cut with water. It was considered déclassé to have wine that was undiluted. That was called mirum. We get the word mir as in like mere Christianity, meaning pure, from this word. But to drink mirum meant you were kind of like a wino, that you were just drinking to get drunk. So cultured Greeks and Romans would have diluted their wine before.